Learning to build websites or apps? Well, no matter what tech stack or tools that you end up using, it all begins with the same fundamental building blocks: HTML and CSS. I'm going to give you a quick and simple primer on HTML and CSS, along with some examples to get you started. Now, by the end of this video, you'll see why you need to learn HTML and CSS together, even though they are two very different languages. You'll understand what HTML is and what CSS is, and the role that each of those plays in building a website or an app. We'll get into some code examples so that you can start building websites right away. And I'll even show you how you can look at the actual HTML and CSS code of any website. Now, a word of warning, after you watch this video, you might never look at websites or apps the same way again. First, you might be wondering, why should you learn HTML and CSS together at the same time? Why not learn one before the other? Well, as you'll see in a moment, HTML and CSS are two different languages, but you can't have one without the other. They're totally interdependent. And when it comes to the full stack of technologies that go into building a website or an app, HTML and CSS are the only absolute constants. No matter what you're building, no matter how you're building it, you will always touch HTML code and CSS code. That's because HTML and CSS make up what's known as the front end of a website or an app. Now, a quick note about JavaScript. JavaScript is another language that's also in the front end, and it's almost always in the mix in any modern day website or app, so you'll learn it soon enough. But JavaScript is not essential in the same way that HTML and CSS is. So we're going to focus here on HTML and CSS. So what is HTML? Hypertext Markup Language. It's quite literally the content that users see on the screen. So all of the other programming technologies, they all come together to produce an HTML document that's shown to the user on the screen. Think of everything that you build on the web like you're building a house. Every house starts with a frame, and HTML is that frame. It's the beams that form the structure and the shape of the house. But just like you can't live in a house when it's just the studs, HTML alone won't get you very far. That brings us to CSS. What is CSS? Cascading style sheets. I'll explain the whole cascading thing in just a minute. For now, let's get back to our house. HTML gave us the frame of the house. CSS puts up the walls, the paint, the flooring, the textures that give the house its character. CSS is how we define fonts and colors and styles. CSS is also how we define layout and the arrangement of elements on the page. Okay, enough theory. Let's get into some code and start building with HTML and CSS. All right, let's start by creating a new file. We're going to call it index.html. Save that here. And before we do anything, let's open up our file in a browser. Google Chrome is my browser of choice. Okay, we are looking at our HTML file, but there's nothing here. Let's start adding some stuff. I'm going to start by quickly adding the HTML and body tags. And I'm going to use some help from AI for that. This basically just sets up the page. And you can learn more about the HTML, the head tag, the body tag a little bit later on, but let's dive right into the fun stuff, shall we? The first concept to understand in HTML are tags. There are many different types of tags, but here's one that you'll probably use a lot. It's called an H1 tag. It's typically used for the top headline shown on any page. I saved my document. Let's go back to Chrome and refresh. And there we go. We have our Hello World H1 tag. And there are also H2 and H3 and H4 for smaller headlines elsewhere on the page. But here's another one that you'll use a lot. It's the paragraph tag. And that's simply P. As you can see, every tag starts with the opening tag and the closing tag. The only difference between them is the closing tag has this backslash at the start of it. So most tags in HTML require an opening tag and a closing tag. And if you're missing one or the other, it can cause things to break on your page. I saved. Let's see how we're doing. And we've got our headline and a paragraph. Exciting stuff. How about an unordered list? That looks something like this. It's UL. We've got the opening tag and closing tag. And inside, we've got list items, which are LI. And each of these gets a closing tag as well. I'm going to save and see how we're doing. And there's our list. It's a bullet list. We can make an ordered list with numbers. And the only difference there is instead of UL for unordered list, we're going to do ordered list, which is OL. And we changed the opening tag, so we have to make sure that the closing tag matches. And there's our ordered list. For now, I'll give you one more HTML tag that you will absolutely use quite often in your work, and that is the div tag. That looks like this. And it's used for dividing areas of your page. Now, I'm wrapping all of the content that I've built so far inside the opening and closing div tags. And a best practice in HTML is to use indenting to clearly define nesting your tags. As you can see inside the body tag, which opens with the body and closing body tag, then we have this div tag, opening and closing, followed by one H1 headline, one paragraph, an unordered list with 3 list items, and then an ordered list with 3 list items. Now you'll notice, even though I added the div tag, you don't really see it. It's sort of invisible by default. Well, once we introduce CSS, that's going to start to change. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So now you understand tags and how tags can be nested in HTML. The next concept to understand with HTML is attributes. So every tag can have a number of different attributes, and they usually look like this. Let's start with the ID attribute. Any tag in HTML can have an ID. And an attribute starts with the name of the attribute, and then equals, and then open quotes, and then the value for the attribute, and then closed quotes. And tags can have more than one attribute. Another common attribute is class. So let's do class equals headlines. I'll add a few more attributes throughout my HTML here. Another attribute that you might see from time to time would be data, and that's usually used to pass some data from the HTML to some JavaScript that you might be working with, and that's something that's a little bit more advanced that you can learn a little bit later. And there are lots of other attributes. Some of them are specific to certain tags in HTML. Now, again, if I refresh my page, all the attributes that I've added so far haven't actually changed the visual output of these HTML tags. Again, we're going to get to that in just a minute once we introduce CSS. But first I'm going to pause and I'm going to open up one of my real projects. Actually, at the time that I'm recording this, I'm in the process of building out the new website for fullstackfounder.co. And so far, it's just an HTML page with a bunch of content that I'm starting to design in the browser. And so here's a look at what a more advanced level HTML document looks like. As you can see tags, you can see classes. I'm not using a whole lot of IDs right now. Oh, you know what? I just remembered about one of the most important tags that you'll ever use, and that's the A tag. That is a link tag. You know what? Let's add a link into our example. I'm going to go back to our example. I'm going to add another paragraph, and I'm going to add a link around this last word, link. So a link tag looks like this, href. I know that's a weird attribute, and it has a closing A tag. And inside that href attribute, that's where we put the website that we're going to link to. Now let's go back to our page, and here's that second paragraph that we've added. And as you can see, it contains a link at the very end of it. And when someone clicks that, it would navigate to that website. If we want this URL to open up in a new browser tab instead of the current one, we can add another attribute that's called target equals underscore blank. To be honest, I'm not sure why the underscore is there, but that just means that when someone clicks it, it will open up that web page in a new browser tab instead of the current one. As a best practice, you typically want to open up a new browser tab if you're sending someone to a different website, but keep them in the same browser tab if it's a link internally to another page on your own website. Okay, it's later in the day. I'm continuing this project now. So our bare bones HTML web page has some content on it, but obviously it doesn't look very good. So that's why we need to introduce some CSS to give it some styling. So let's start doing that. The easiest way to start here is to add some on-page CSS. To do that, inside the head tags, I can add another HTML tag called style. So we've got an opening style tag and a closing style tag. What that means is everything inside these tags can be CSS code. So let's start writing some CSS code. CSS starts with what's known as selectors. First, let's select all of the P tags. So that's going to look like this: P, space, open brackets, and then inside the brackets is where we add attributes for CSS. Let's start with a simple one: color. So color, colon, space, red. And then you end the line with a semicolon. I guess that's called. Now my coding app here, Visual Studio Code, actually adds the color there, but that's not actually in the code. That's just my text editor is adding that in for my convenience. Okay, so what this code basically says is that all P tags, so we have a P tag here, a P tag here, all P tags, the text in there should use the color red. I'm going to save that, go back to our page. I'm going to refresh. And as you can see, our paragraphs have turned to the color red. There we go. So that is CSS in action. Now let's target all of the list items. So we can do li space colon, and let's make all of the list items bold. The attribute for that is font weight. Now there are other ways to write this. You can use numeric font weights like 100, 200, 300, 700, 800, but this is simple enough. This works. So I'm going to save that and let's refresh. And as you can see, all of the list items, that includes the unordered list and the ordered lists, all of these are li tags, which were selected by this piece of CSS. So that's how you can select elements, right? You can select a P tag, the li tag, the h1 tag. You can even select the body tag, which would apply to all of the content on the page. So let's do that. Order actually does matter in CSS because styles that come below can override the styles that came above it. And so that's actually why I want to put the body style at the top so that we can set something like the font. Let's change the font to, for that we're going to use font family, colon, and we're going to change it to Arial. And typically you want to do what's known as font stacks. So Arial, Helvetica, and then sans serif. You can have a lot more fonts in there. Basically what that means is first the user's computer will see if they have Arial installed. If not, then they'll fall back to Helvetica. If not, then they'll fall back to a generic sans serif font. Let's save that and refresh the page. And now, as you can see, everything on the page has changed to Arial font. And to start to show you some of that cascading in action, we can go to our P tag and use font family. And here, let's use Courier New, which looks very different from Arial. So let's refresh that. Okay, so here, as you can see, the body tag first sets the Arial font, and then the P tags, which came below it in the CSS, the body tag first, and then P tag. The P tag then sort of overwrites what was set by the body tag to say everything should default to Arial, but if it's a P tag, then we're going to use Courier New, and that's what you can see here. Okay, so we've selected existing elements on the page just by what type of element they are. We can also select elements by their ID. So you see how all these list items, I gave them unique IDs. This one is item 1, item 2, item 3. And for down here, I chose the names item 1B, 2B, 3B. Let's target just item 3. So that's an ID. And the way that we can target that in CSS is li, #, and then the name of the ID, which is item 3. Let's make that one color green. And I'll refresh the page. And as you can see, only item 3 is green because we're targeting that ID. So IDs are typically unique on the page. There really should only be one element on the page that has this exact ID name. Classes, on the other hand, can have names that are used multiple times throughout the page. For example, you can see down here in the class attribute, I used the name blue. It's used twice. And so we can do this. li period means we're targeting a class name, and we'll use blue. As you can see, the AI is completing my code for me. And for these, we want the color to be blue. I'm going to save that and refresh. Okay, so you can see this li has the class of blue, and so does this li, and so those items are blue. Okay, we're making progress here. Let's style one more thing, and that'll be this div. Now, we could just target the element div, and this would apply to all divs on the page, but most websites have many divs on the page, so it's probably a good idea to use either an ID or a class to target this. Let's make it an ID equals, we'll call it container. I'm just making up a name here. And we'll target that like this, container. Now, I could have used div container. It'll work either way. But here, I'm just being a little bit more generic and just using container without specifying which element. In other words, we could apply the same ID to a different element like an H1 or a P, and these styles would still apply because we are not specifying that it has to be a div. Let's just leave it like that. And first, let's add a border so that we can actually see our div. So we're going to do border. And border is sort of a special attribute which can take multiple attributes all combined in the same line. So we can do something like this. 2 pix, px is for pixels, then space, solid. We don't want it to be like a dashed line or a dotted line. And let's use purple as the color. And by the way, more commonly, you would use like a hex code, like something like that, or an RGB code, something like that. But for the sake of a very simple example here, you can literally use the word of the color. So we're just going to use purple. And let's see how this looks. Okay, our div has a box around it. And now divs are what's known as a block element. So that means that it's always going to be full width by default unless we add other elements into the page. That's fine. All right, the next thing that we'll do here is give it a background color. Let's use background. And you can use background color or just the word background here. Let's use pink. It's a very colorful web page. Okay, we've got our background. It's pink. Still have the purple border around it. One thing that I'm noticing here is that the text is butting up right up against the left edge here. So we want to add what's known as padding. That gives it a little bit of inside space inside this box. So let's use padding of 30 pix. What that's going to do is give it 30 pixels of space on the top, right, bottom, and left sides of the div. And there we go. We have 30 pixels of space all around it. And you can do more with padding, like 2 numbers, which would look like this. What that does is 30 pixels on the top and bottom, 10 pixels on the left and right. Or we can even do 30, 20, 50, and that's 30 at the top, then 10 on the right, 20 on the bottom, 50 on the left. Let's just leave it at 30 all the way around. That's just a single number. That means it's going to be applied to all 4 sides. Cool. Let's work with margin a little bit. Let's go back to our li element and say every one of these li elements, we want a little bit more space below each one. So let's do margin bottom 10 pix. And save. And when I refresh, as you can see, it added 10 pixels of space in between each list item. And let's also put some styles on the ul element. And let's say this should have margin of 40 pixels all around it. Same deal here. If we use a single number, similar to padding, it'll add 40 pixels of top margin, right margin, bottom margin, and left margin. And you can see that one now has more space around it. It has more margin. Okay, so you see the basic patterns of how CSS code actually works. Okay, so now you see the basic patterns of how CSS code actually works. It's kind of cool, right? But is this where all the styles should live in your project? Well, this gets back to the whole concept of cascading. This is why CSS is known as cascading style sheets. One way to call CSS into your project is to put it in an external file. So let's create a new file called styles.css. And let's copy all of our styles. I'm going to copy and then I'll delete them and then I'll paste them just like that into styles.css. And now we'll need to reference to this styles.css file from our HTML file. I can get rid of these style tags and I'm going to replace it with a link tag, rel equals style sheet. That's the type of file that we are calling into our project. And href equals styles.css. We'll close that. And this particular tag does not need a closing tag. It's just a single line tag. Some tags in HTML are like that. And as you can see, our styles are still in place because they're being referenced from this separate file into this new file. So that's what's known as an external style sheet. The next level down the cascade is the on-page style sheet, which is what I showed you before. We can do style, and I'm going to show you the concept of cascading in action here, right? So in our styles.css, we're targeting the li blue class, and we're making it the color blue. That's like the default, like royal blue, if you will. We want to make that sort of a lighter, like cyan color, right? So let's do the same thing. Li, we're targeting all of the class blue, but this time we're going to make it cyan. And I'm going to refresh. And as you can see, it went to that like lighter, like cyan color. Now, why did that one win out? That's because of the cascading effect of style sheets. First, it looks for an external style sheet. Then it looks for an on-page style sheet, because on-page CSS would always take precedence over an external CSS. But there's one more level down the cascade, and that's known as inline CSS. So we can go to one of these, we can go to any element, but let's go to that same element that has the blue class, and let's add another attribute called style equals color. This time, let's use brown. So this is literally just CSS code. It's just like the code that you would put inside a CSS selector here, but you just put it inside the style attribute on an HTML tag. And here we're saying just this element should be brown, even though it has the blue class. So let's save that, and I'm going to refresh. So as you can see, this one is brown. It has the blue class, and this one also has the blue class, but no inline style. So that's why it defaulted to cyan. And so that's the cascading effect in action again. It starts with the external style sheet, then looks to on-page styles, then looks to inline styles. And that's like the final level that always takes precedence over everything else that comes before it. All right, one last trick that I want to show you, and you're going to really find this pretty cool, I think. You can actually look under the hood and see the actual HTML code and the CSS code of any web page on the internet. In Google Chrome, it's as simple as going to View, Developer, View Source. And here is the code for this page. And you can do that on any other public web page. And if we want to take a look at the CSS, here's the link that points to the style sheet. I can click this button, and now it's showing me the styles.css, and I can even look at that too. Pretty cool, huh? But what I think you'll find even more useful is the developer tools for inspecting elements. You know, because very often you'll be looking at the front end of your web page, and you might be wondering, why does this item appear brown? Well, to inspect that, I can use Command-Shift-C, and that's going to open up developer tools. The other way to get to it is View, Developer, Inspect Elements. And that's going to open up this panel. And you can place this panel on the left or right or on the side or in a separate window. I like it here on the bottom. And that gives you the same source code. And as you can see, elements are highlighting, but you can also highlight individual elements on the page. So I'm going to target that one element there, and it's going to highlight down here. And then over here on the right side, it's going to show me the CSS. And I can see the blue is crossed out, the cyan was crossed out because the inline style is what overrode those other ones. And so this is where I can literally inspect what the styles are on any given element. So here's that P tag, here's the red and the font family. And so that's a way to sort of like see what's going on, and you can troubleshoot. And it's how we put together HTML and CSS to design and piece together a web page. So now you've got the essential building blocks, HTML and CSS. But there's one more tool that has revolutionized the way that professionals design and build in the browser with HTML and CSS. In fact, it's become so important in the modern day workflow that I would recommend that you learn how to use this tool sooner rather than later in your Learn to Code journey. It's called Tailwind CSS. I created another video, which I invite you to watch. It's where I cover what is Tailwind CSS and why it's so important that you start to use it in every new project that you work on. I'll see you there.